It's been a year since the last devlog, and it's time to get this project to the point where it's actually somewhat playable. Or, maybe I could improve the water graphics instead. That sounds way more exciting. In all seriousness though, after not having touched the pirate game for a year, I think this will be a decent way to re-familiarize myself with the project, and who doesn't love good-looking water in video games? The first thing I want to address is what happens when your camera goes from above the water to below the surface. Right now, I'm just enabling the underwater fog effect based on whether the camera is submerged or not, but as you can see, this approach breaks down when half of the screen is above water and the other half is submerged. The fog is either on or off, there's no in between. I've seen some assets on the Unity Asset Store which seem to be able to render fog for only parts of your screen based on whether or not they're submerged, so it's clearly possible to do, I just need to figure out how. After a few days of learning about Unity's scriptable renderer features, I've managed to write a custom one that applies the fog effect to the whole screen, kind of like a post-processing effect. That means I can get rid of this janky fog quad that I've been using until now. Man, I really hated that thing. From here, I can just sample the wave height at every pixel that's being rendered, and if the pixel in question is above the wave height, I discard it using the clip function. At this point, you may be able to see a slight problem, which is that the fog is being applied above the water in some places. This is because for the fog, I'm calculating the wave height at each pixel, while the water only has its height calculated at each vertex in the mesh. It's arguably an improvement over what I had before, but at this point I'm honestly not sure how I'll solve the problem of the fog not properly lining up with the water mesh. While I think about that, I'm going to try to get some reflections going because the water surface could really use some spicing up. Unity has this boat racing demo project, and it has water with reflections, so why don't I just... Yep. Select all this. Do a little copy-paste. And voila! Water with reflections. That was easy. So now I have working reflections in my test project, and the next step is obviously to bring them into the actual project, but I'm a bit concerned about whether the reflections will look okay with my waves. The way these reflections are generated is by rendering the scene upside down and from beneath the water using a second camera. That camera's output is stored in a texture, which I can then sample in a shader to apply the reflection to the water surface. This works really well for a perfectly flat reflective surface because, well, it's flat. There's no variation in height, and the direction the surface is facing is constant across the whole plane. However, you may have noticed that my game's water is anything but perfectly flat, especially out on the open ocean. I'm expecting this to result in the reflections looking incorrect a lot of the time, but I guess we'll find out soon. Okay, I've got to say, this turned out way better than I expected. I've been sitting here for the last few minutes just watching the camera spin around the island, completely mesmerized by how good it looks. Unfortunately though, it's not entirely sunshine and rainbows. As I predicted, the reflections don't really hold up to scrutiny away from the island where the waves are bigger. You can see here that when the boat is on top of a wave, its reflection doesn't line up with where it intersects the water surface, because the reflection plane is technically several units lower down. However, it's not nearly as bad as I thought it would be, and I'd say it's still pretty convincing, especially if you're not paying super close attention to it. I might also reduce the reflection strength, at least out here on the open ocean, since choppy waves should make the surface less reflective. The next big thing I want to address is the lack of refraction. Looking at the water in shallow areas shouldn't give you a perfect view of the seafloor or whatever else is underwater. There should be a bit of distortion. Luckily for me, Unity has this handy option right here. Enabling this spits out a texture containing all the opaque objects in the scene, which I can just sample with a small offset in the water shader. After several hours of trying to emulate a physically accurate refraction effect with, questionable results, I decided to just simplify things. Unfortunately, it might actually be a bit hard to see it because it still looks wonky at high distortion strength values, so I've turned it down quite a lot. I've also spent hours fiddling with how the water surface color is combined with the reflection and refraction, but I'm still not entirely happy with it. Part of the problem is that it looks pretty good with the sun about 25 degrees above the horizon, but when the sun is directly overhead, the water in the distance is way too bright. This happens because the reflection texture has to store a lit version of the scene in order for reflected objects to look right, but after I add the reflection to the watercolor, lighting is applied to the water as well, effectively resulting in double lighting for all reflected and refracted objects. This makes the reflections too bright, which in turn makes the water in the distance look washed out and just not nearly as blue as it should be. For now though, let's come back to the underwater fog because I've scrapped the previous solution. No more height sampling. Instead, I'm now using an additional renderer feature to generate a texture which I can then use to determine where the fog should be shown. First, everything above the horizon is set to white. Then the water meshes are rendered into the texture one by one, with the top side being rendered as white and the underside as black. The result is pixel-perfect application of the water fog. However, this approach has its own problem. The fact that I'm using the horizon as the base for the mask means that at certain camera positions and view angles, the water meshes don't fill in the pixels all the way to the horizon, and it's a lot more noticeable the further the camera is above or below the sea level. I'll need to find a way to properly fill in those areas. If you've got any suggestions for how it could be done, please do let me know. And while you're down there in the comments section, smash the like button as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.